Hi, I'm Antonia. This is Universally Me. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Antonia Carlotta, and go check out my Patreon where I'm always putting up bonus content. Last year, when we got news that there was a new Wolfman in the works starring Ryan Gosling, I made a video with everything you needed to know about the original Wolfman so you could get ready. And now we've got news that there's probably a new mummy in the works. It may have Brendan Fraser if we're lucky. And, well, now it's time I make a video about the mummy so you can be ready for this one too. Now, obviously, this is far from the first time we've had a new take on the mummy, and I'll get into all of those later. But for this video, I'm going to be focusing predominantly on the 1932 film. So I'll talk about the production, the actors, some behind-the-scenes stuff, as well as the film's influence on future movies. So let's get talking about the mummy. The Mummy was a pre-code horror film released by Universal in 1932. In the film, an ancient Egyptian named Imhotep is discovered by a team of archaeologists and brought back to life when one of them reads an ancient scroll from his tomb. Disguised as a modern Egyptian named Ardith Bey, Imhotep searches for his lost love, who he believes has been reincarnated into a modern Egyptian woman. Now, unlike the Universal monster movies that came before it, The Mummy wasn't adapted from a novel. I have seen some comparisons to Arthur Conan Doyle's The Ring of Thoth, and I do see the resemblance there. Capitalizing on the success of Dracula and Frankenstein the year before, along with the hype of the opening of King Tutankhamun's tomb, Junior Laemmle asked Richard Schayer and Nina Wilcox Putnam to write a treatment for a mummy film. He then hired John Balderston to write the screenplay, Karl Freund to direct, and filming for The Mummy started in September of 1932. Boris Karloff, still riding the high from Frankenstein, was tapped to play the lead. Though he's better known for his look as Frankenstein, the process to become The Mummy was much more grueling. In order to become The Mummy, Boris Karloff had to sit in the makeup chair with Jack Pierce for 8 hours each day. Here's what they did during those 8 hours. The mummy wrappings were made of linen that would get boiled until they were basically falling apart. And Jack Pierce would then apply them to Karloff vertically, diagonally, and horizontally until they were completely covering his skin. And on top of the wrappings, he would then put a thin layer of clay. Then he glued cotton onto Karloff's skin and pulled at it with tweezers. He used grease paint to match the cotton to the bandages and brown pencil to accentuate the lines and wrinkles under the studio lights. And that's not quite all. Karloff's hair was coated in grease paint and his legs were bound together. Karloff once called the removal of the makeup the most trying experience he ever endured because it was so painful. All this, and Karloff hardly even appears on screen as the mummy. I think that's one reason that for as great as the look and concept are, The Mummy tends to get a little overlooked in the original monster canon, because Boris Karloff spends so much more of the movie dressed as Ardith Bey instead of the mummy. Another reason The Mummy might not be at the top of every classic horror list is because it has less horror than some of the other films. The Mummy really leaned more into the romance, so though there's a monster, though there are some good suspense building moments, it's not as much a horror film as other horror films are. There is one scene that pretty much everyone agrees is the quintessential horror scene from the film, and maybe just generally the best scene from the film. You don't have to get very far to watch it. It is the opening scene. It's a great introduction to the mummy. As an archaeologist reads the Scroll of Thoth, we slowly see the mummy start to awaken, start to move. It's all very quiet, slow, no music, nothing. The camera shows just parts of the mummy at a time. Karl Freund does a great job building the tension in this scene. Another standout scene is the flashback scene. Freund made the incredible decision to show this jump back in time as a silent film. And I know it might seem a little obvious now or overdone, but I think this might have been the first time that was ever done. He did it as a real silent film with the music, exaggerated gestures, and all. And many of the Mummy films use the same technique when they're doing their flashback storytelling. Behind the scenes, not everything was going as well as they appeared to be going on camera, and I'm specifically referring to Zita Johann here. I do want to start by saying that I love that she was cast in this part because she was a firm believer in mysticism and reincarnation, and just feels like there's nobody better. But I feel like I'm always talking about these women who had a hard time on these old film sets. Mary Philbin in Phantom of the Opera, Evelyn Ankers in The Wolfman, and unfortunately, Zita was no exception. Karl Freund and Zita Johann did not like each other, and the set was wrought with tension. Karl Freund was under a lot of pressure directing one of his first films and with a shooting schedule of just 23 days. Zita felt like she was the scapegoat, that Karl was just looking for any reason to give her trouble so that he could call her temperamental and point to her as the problem. At one point, he even told her that she'd have to appear nude from the waist up. Zita wanted to give him hell for it, but she knew that the censors would never let it fly, so she told him that if he thought the censors would allow it, she would be fine with it. And he never brought it up again. Of course, that wasn't all, though. He also refused to get her a chair with her name on it, would make her stand for hours against a board on a wall so as not to wrinkle her dress, and even left her unprotected amongst real lions for a now-deleted scene while he and the crew remained protected inside cages. She worked demanding hours and even shared a story of one Saturday night on set at 11 p.m. when she passed out cold for an hour. It was too late to get a doctor, so as she says, the crew just prayed her back to consciousness. Despite her trouble, Zita still gave a great performance, and to his credit, Freund still pulled off a pretty solid movie. Though The Mummy was far from the first film of its kind, it still managed to stand out. Egyptomania peaked in the 1920s with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, resulting in a handful of mummy films, Cleopatra movies, and Egyptian-inspired design and architecture, like the Egyptian Theater in LA, for example. But with all that, the movie still grossed almost $400,000 on a budget of $196,000. And though The Mummy might not be the most remembered Universal monster, it still holds its own 90 years later. And I don't know if The Mummy gets enough credit for its innovations. It was actually ahead of its time in some ways. First, it's the first Universal horror movie to use a musical score. And that was actually Karl Freund's idea to get the audience more emotionally invested in the film. And these days, there's no question, especially in horror, that music is seen as a vital piece of the thrill. This film also pioneered the use of a process screen, which is the precursor to the modern-day green screen. So one film crew went to Cairo and they took shots and videos of locations, and they would send those back to the studio where it was projected on a screen and recorded. Then the actors would go in and act out their scene, and the recording of the scenes with the recording of the actors were synchronized over each other to look like the actors were in Cairo. Like, what a crazy legacy to come from this film that nobody talks about. And speaking of legacy, how about the film's legacy at Universal? In the 1940s, Universal started making sequels, including The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Tomb, The Mummy's Ghost, The Mummy's Curse, and then Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy in 1955. In the 1950s and 60s, Hammer Films made a series of mummy movies, with their first being based off of Universal's two films, The Mummy's Hand and The Mummy's Tomb. And then in 1999 comes probably the most popular mummy film. I have to admit that I didn't even see this movie for the first time until pretty recently. I don't know how that happened, but I love it. I think it's so fun. I love Brendan Fraser. If they do make a new Mummy film, I hope we get to see him in it. It does take pieces from the original 1932 film, but it's definitely its own standalone film. It's got its own vibe, and I really appreciate that. The film was so successful that it set off its own series of sequels and prequels, I think even video games, and definitely a short-lived animated series. And then, of course, my favorite thing to come out of the 1999 Mummy is, of course, the ride at Universal. And then we get to 2017 and I get mad because I think about the 2017 Mummy and what was supposed to be the start of the dark universe. And I don't know, I just think Universal let us down. I think they kind of took the elements that they thought were gonna make easy money and they tried to cram them all together and it really backfired on them. So mostly I just try to pretend that that doesn't exist. Anyway, that is not the note that I want to end this video on. I want to end this video on a great note. So instead of thinking about that, let us think instead about Karl Freund's amazing cinematography and about Boris Karloff's wonderful creepy performance and Zita Johann's beautiful costumes and everything that she endured to survive this movie. Let us think about the wonderful legacy of films that The Mummy left behind. And if you want to learn more about The Mummy that didn't make this video, make sure you check out my Patreon. I've got some new stuff up. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Antonia Carlotta. And thank you so much for watching. Bye.